My name is Chad McPherson, PhD student at the University of Iowa in the Department of Sociology. My dissertation actually looks at boards of trustees and regents in higher education, and in particular kind of the structure of governance and what governance really is in the present day. Melissa asked me to speak today based on a paper I had with Michael Sauder in Administrative Science Quarterly a few years back. The paper, it's an ethnography of a drug court in a metropolitan community. We examine institutional complexity that kind of manifests in the everyday work and practices of this drug court, which is really, it's like an amalgam of different types of professionals who come together to assess long-term clients, participants, or offenders, depending on what you want to call them, who are involved in this drug court. And so it's kind of these different professionals who come together to make decisions about the care, about sanctions, about involvement in this long-term drug court program. And in it, we kind of look at institutional complexity and the use of institutional logics on the ground. I didn't start with a research question. I didn't choose the site because I was particularly interested in a set phenomena, if you will, or theoretical orientation. I chose it because actually it was part of the qualitative research course that I was taking in graduate school. And in advance of that course, already having kind of declared that I was going to be a qualitative person and working with Mike, I looked to something that I thought might be interesting. And in particular, actually, I was interested in drug courts for the sake of tangentially associated with this idea of reintegrative shaming from a criminological perspective, which I don't do criminology at all. But at the time, that's what I was interested in. And I have a remarkable knack for choosing sites and things that are very difficult to gain access to. If you look at my track record, that's what I end up doing. And that certainly was the case in drug court. I actually had some prior knowledge of drug court based on this is my second profession. I was actually a practicing counselor in a different state. And then I moved into management when I was very young of this large public service organization that dealt with addiction and women's services and domestic violence. And some of my staff actually went to and advised at drug court. And so I was really curious about what drug court was, and they were kind of blowing up. So that's how I chose it. I actually chose it because it was a particular setting. I attempted to contact several drug courts. Granted, I am in Iowa City, Iowa, but I looked quite far and wide, potentially willing to do a lot of travel. And as it turned out, I did. I don't recommend choosing research based on site. But if ever one is going to do it, I would say very early in career, or I'm guessing very late in career after I'm tenured. In this case, it was great because I was fairly early in graduate school. My options were still all kind of out in front of me. I hadn't established any kind of brand or identity as an academic or a researcher yet. And I was beginning to only really become accustomed to different literatures. And actually that included the organization's literature. I didn't know it very well. And didn't even really understand organizational scholarship until shortly before I got into the field, actually. In terms of negotiating access or getting into the field, it took about 5 months to get approval. I sent letters and made phone calls to, I think I was counting this morning, I think it was 6 different drug courts, and was really denied access at any of the places I sought to kind of at least to get their ear to talk about what I was doing. So what I did was, because I was really bent on wanting to look at drug courts, I actually I made contact with an old boss, a mentor, who also happened to do a lot of state level stuff. He made some phone calls and vouched for me. What that did was it gave me the ear of a particular metropolitan community with a drug court, and particularly the ear of their adult court services supervisor. She wasn't necessarily interested in me in doing research, but she said, I'll give you a shot. And we spent about an hour on the phone one day and followed it up a couple weeks later where actually twice in the span of a week, I traveled a significant distance and met with her in her office and just kind of talked a little bit about things, kind of negotiated what they were cool with and what they weren't in terms of kind of how I conducted the research. Actually, as it turns out, there was almost no limitations once they got to know me. I had carte blanche. I had total freedom. However, at first, I think they were very wary of this dude coming in and being involved. And then I had to meet with the chief judge of the district. And he's a very nice guy, but he's a very kind of strange and intimidating guy. So I spent about an hour talking with him, in which I assumed I'd be presenting a case for doing this research and why even strategically it might be advantageous to them. But he actually didn't want, the conversation was casual. I spent an hour essentially being felt out by him, which was a very strange thing. So I met with him, and then once he signed off, I actually had 2 more meetings, both with the state's attorney's office and then with the public defender's office. Once all of them signed off on this, I had consent, and then I had to negotiate what they were officially willing to allow me to do and not. Long story long, it was an arduous process. It was not easy, and I was pretty sure at least 3 different times that I'd have to pick something else. But I was really fortunate. What did I do, or how did I design it once I got kind of gained entree? Well, first of all, I would say in terms of design, I was really fortunate in that there was an existing structure. Drug court met twice a week. There were 2 days a week that they held drug court, on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Largely the same people were in attendance, same professionals, with some variation based on, people being busy. And so given that there was several hours of time twice a week and this group of individuals, it was kind of set out in front of me what I could do in terms of actual involvement, which made it easy. So my initial goal, I will say, was I wanted at least 1 year of observation and try and alternate Tuesdays and Thursdays so that I at least attended 1 day per week for 1 year. And that 1 day would vary from, say, 3 hours of participation to 8 or 9 hours of participation. As it turned out, I did some other things, which I'll briefly mention in a moment. Reality is, once I got into the field, especially on that first day, no matter how much I tried to systematize, it was just a whirlwind. Trying to slow my brain down long enough to even record information in my field notes was fascinating, or not knowing what to focus on and what not to. I remember about a month ago, for a completely different reason, I was looking at field notes from the first day, and I was writing down things like, I wrote down the color of the ties of each of the professionals that were involved, like as if they had anything to do with what I was interested in, and as a sociologist. But that's kind of what I was doing, where I was just trying to put everything down onto a piece of paper. And of course, I know this now, but in the process of doing a lot of that, I know I was missing quite a bit. This idea of systematizing your note taking, at least as much as possible. In truth, I think that there was subtle tweaks, right? And my notes were becoming more nuanced and slightly maybe more focused as time went on. But at least from what I can recollect, I would guesstimate that it was probably 6 months into data collection before I really looked to carefully refine what I was writing down and taking notes on and what I wasn't. And I was just afraid that I had no idea was really cool and interested in me. And in part, it was just, it was just that fear of if I start refining this too much, then I'm going to start losing information, and I'm not going to keep my mind open to things. While I took rigorous field notes every day I was in the field, the other thing I did was when I got home, no matter what time I got home from long days of travel, I did always write 2 to 5 page memos. And that's single-spaced, just basically put everything out there. Look at my field notes as I'm doing it to recollect, but also just just kind of purging myself of all of the thoughts and the stuff that I wouldn't necessarily put on paper while I was in the field. And then kind of dedicating the last half a page to a page to thinking sociologically, to putting my sociologist hat on and thinking a little bit more about theory, and especially as time was going on and I was reading literatures. So I had access. I gained this access, and the question that Melissa asked was, did people come to trust me? And invariably they did. I mean, and there's a lot of evidence for that. So, for example, I was invited to a lot of things tangentially associated with the drug court. I went to a conference, a 2-day mini conference, like Midwest Drug Court, blah, 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 in Chicago. I started hanging out with the probation officers who were the probation officers for drug court on occasion, and I would travel around with them on their days when they were making home visits, essentially doing like police ride-alongs, but with probation officers, basically talking. And I went out and had martinis with the judge on a few occasions. The Tuesday, I think it was Tuesday's drug courts went well into the late afternoon, and he notoriously went out for martinis like 3 days a week. And so he would invite me out on occasion to have a couple drinks. And then I'd have to go find somewhere to have a big bite to eat so I could drive a long distance back. And I attended things like car washes for the Drug Court Association in the county. And they basically were looking to raise money for activities and stuff like that. So I did stuff like that. I was invited to things. I went to the judge's 60th birthday party. Somebody invited me, which was kind of fun. And those were the big things. But in terms of, how did I know that they came to trust me? Qualitatively speaking, it's hard to put words to that feeling you get in interactions with people. But a lot of times it would just be, probably 3 or 4 months in, I noticed that there wasn't as much censoring of the kinds of things they might say. I mean, it might have been actually shorter than 3 or 4 months, because at first I was attending every day, and they'd start to refer to certain drug court clients or court offenders by nicknames that they had from, and they were derogatory sometimes. There was no name calling for a while when I was there. It was very they were frank in their communications, but it was very routinized in terms of they stuck to professional language. And that kind of changed over time. And it also changed, in other ways. So I would strategically try to, when I could, travel down there early, so I could get to the court an hour and a half or 2 hours early. Invariably, about an hour before court started, especially the public defender, but also the clinicians from the different community service organizations would be there in the hallway outside of the designated drug courtroom. And we'd do a lot of just kind of chatting on benches, or I'd go with them when they go meet with people and sit in back rooms. And at about the 6-month mark, for example, they told me to stop sitting in the back of the courtroom, and they wanted me to come sit in the jury box. Which a lot of the drug court clientele actually later on, after I'd been there for several months, like 9 months, thought I was one of the criminal justice people. Actually, they had said, "Oh, you're just observing." They had no idea. They assumed. What was my first day like? As I told you, it was a whirlwind. I can tell you this: I don't remember that much. I remember being really stressed out. I don't remember what all I remember not knowing what I should and should not take notes on. But the pervasive image that sticks with me from that first day was I didn't really think about this too much before getting there, but I remember being wowed by the idea that I just kind of dropped into a world that existed before me. And there isn't really a lot of introduction. It's just, here you go. Now we're going to keep working. You do your thing. And it was a cool feeling, but it was very overwhelming. At about a year, I said to myself, I remember saying to myself, and I wrote about it, that I felt as though I was starting, that I pretty much had seen all of the things I needed to see, right? Granted, the cases were different. Situations and circumstances might be different. There might be particular kind of captivating story that might happen. But generally, I kind of knew what was going on. And I saw most of what I needed to see. That being said, kind of my policy there is when I started to say that, I figured I probably should stay in the field for an extra 3 months. And so I stayed in the field. I think in the ASQ paper we said 15 months, and I think it's actually incorrect. I think it was 16 months I was in the field. And that included other things I didn't mention, like interviews, attending some of the other type of things, and doing some work with the clerk of court. I mentioned earlier that they kind of, over time, I had carte blanche. They actually let me work with the clerk of court to go back through transcripts and records to clarify things and to make sure what I had recorded was correct on certain occasions. There were a few limitations, but they were based on very particular circumstances and sensitive to community politics. How did I negotiate the process of exiting? It was pretty clean, at least in the case of drug court. So one of the things I did, and I haven't mentioned this, but one of the things I did with the drug court team was at about the 9-month mark, I think at about 15-month mark, and then actually, I think 6 months or more after I left the field, I actually gave presentations to the drug court team on my findings. And it was, for one, it was a great way to just begin to try to push myself to summarize some things and work through some ideas. 2, I wanted feedback, right? Even though I knew I was talking to a bunch of non-academics. And so I tried to stay as grounded in language and ideas close to, what they might be able to, I won't say what they understood, but what they could identify with and speak on. Although some of the sociological theory kind of bled into some of these presentations, but it gave me an opportunity to try to explain things in practical terms. And it also gave me a chance to hear from them. So for example, I think in the very first one at the 9-month mark when I was presenting, and I probably shouldn't have included a bunch of sociological jargon, but someone I remember saying, "You're just dressing shit up." Later on, as time went on, and by the third presentation, I think people had a greater understanding of what I was trying to do and appreciated it, even though they didn't really care that much about it. But that was kind of part of my process. And it was also part of the exit. At the 15-plus month mark, I told them I wasn't going to be coming back to collect any more, to do any more observation and be involved in the courtroom. I basically told them, and it was like, cool, we'll see you around, let's email, you're going to come back and do a presentation down the road, make sure you send us your manuscripts, blah, 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 blah. I still, to this day, receive a Christmas card from the adult court services supervisor. She addresses my whole family, not just me. She knows the names of my kids. So, but it's also, at least in my case, it's extraordinarily anticlimactic. I do owe these people a ton, given that I got an ASQ article out of it, which was a big deal for me and still is a big deal. But it's very anticlimactic. It's just kind of handshakes and hugs and goodbyes, and then you're done. And, I guess that's no different than a lot of things in life, but at least for me, it felt significant. Yes, I eventually did use NVivo. Now I actually use Atlas TI for things, but I did not at first. use it. I actually did a lot of early coding and analyzing by hand. And I did that because not only was I not familiar with the software, but it was more about mental organization. So you're always imposing a researcher's social construction on things when you're using that qualitative software, because I'm searching for certain things. And early on, I wouldn't even call it analysis. I would just call it review. It would just be days where I just read lots and lots of notes. And then I'd go back to the literature for a few days, and I'd talk to my advisor, my mentor, and about ideas. And then I'd go talk to somebody else about things. And then I'd read some more data. And eventually it did become evident that I needed to use software. But it's actually not that different today. I've done focus groups. I do interviews by phone, interviews in person. I've done other participant observation. And usually when it comes to data for me, I got to soak everything in and do some mental analysis before I ever touch software. But that's me. The first aha moment came at about the 7th month. And it was actually, I was involved in a reading group, one door over from where I'm sitting right now. And it was in a reading group with somebody who was taking the orgs comp, and I was already interested in organizations and thinking about doing it. Actually, I already decided I'd take the orgs comp, but I didn't know the literature very well. And they turned me on to the institutional logics stuff, and I began reading this. And within a month's time, I had spent several hours in Mike Sauder's office talking about logics, and him saying, "Whatever, dude. Keep looking. Maybe there's something there, but you bet." And I'm extremely cautious when it comes to reading literature too, so I don't really jump to say this is a case of. For quite a while, I remember having to read the logic literature for quite a while to try to situate not only the logic literature, but also where my piece, if it did at all, fit in. But it was about the 7th month mark. And then actually the second aha moment wasn't until right about the time that I finished participating in the field. And that was when I read a critique of the logics literature. And the critique really talked about how there was an absence of understanding of logics at the micro level, and in particular in relation to institutional complexity. Nobody cares about this at the moment, but I was really pretty bent on this idea that I was seeing that very thing. And so it was a Tuesday afternoon. I remember that. In terms of actually when did I start analyzing the data, it was not early on. I still have a hard time analyzing data for quite a while. I read memos, and I go back through my memos. I remember I'd go back through memos like every month or so, and kind of think about them in conversation with the literature and with talks and stuff like that. But part of my concern with getting into analysis too early on, and this is me, I know everyone's different, was, so for example, I'm always trying to think about, practically speaking, what I'm observing, what is this a case of, right? And I don't mean like institutional logics, but I also don't mean just drug court, right? So I remember brewing if I tried to say what was this a case of from a sociological standpoint, I was observing problem solving, meaning making and sense making, teamwork, communication and deliberation between a group of varied professionals, and the process of negotiation. And that's what I kind of boiled it down to, but that's a lot. And so I was really scared to start thinking about too much analysis when all of those things were still on the table. It was really actually real and extensive analysis did not begin until I was done with fieldwork. I did some analysis before then, but as I look back, it was, for me, it was pretty useless. It's a little bit different with my current work and interviews, etc. are occurring over a long period of time, but at least with both ethnographic projects I participated in, I had to wait for quite a while. I am still analyzing the data, and I have not been in the field for 5 years with that project. There is, as I mentioned, a follow-up manuscript that we are writing right now, and I've used different data in that manuscript probably 5-6 times over the course of this. This one is a little bit slower than the other one. It's just, at first, it's plain overwhelming. There's no other way to describe it besides plain overwhelming. And in fact, when I said I started doing extensive analysis when I completed fieldwork, that's a lie. It was actually probably 2 months because I procrastinated. I was doing other things. I was involved in comp work, and I didn't even know where to start. So what I focused on, I always kind of focus on. Actually, I don't. In that case, I went back to my field notes. I went back to the journal itself, which was the easiest place to basically look through scribbles and scratches and little notes and jargon and boxes in the corner with potential ideas and stuff like that. But over time, you begin to do a lot of looking through things. But that also gave me an opportunity to go back to the clerk of court at this drug court and get some data that maybe I missed. And that helped too, because I was actually going through official court transcripts for a while. I couldn't keep them. I couldn't make copies of them, but I could look at them and write down notes. And that was great because I was reading a lot of those, and it helped shed some light on things in a way that might not have if I was looking at my memos. One of the important things for me early on in that process of analysis and then writing things up was learning how to talk about the data with others. And so just talking through that, or talking through it with my wife, for example, she's really good at saying, what you just fed me was a bunch of BS. Try to tell me in practical terms what you just said. Because what you just said, my eyes glossed over, I don't care. So what does this really mean? And it was a good opportunity to do some of that. And then Melissa asked me about the review process. It was hell for me. I had 2 revise and resubmits and a conditional acceptance. The first R&R, we had 2 reviewers who loved the paper and 1 reviewer who hated it. They came around to actually love the paper, as it turned out, because at least for the second R&R, they became our strongest advocate over time, which was strange, because this was my first opportunity to work with a journal like ASQ. It was a much different experience than a couple prior publications I had. And so it was hell. It was a long process for us with 2 R&Rs and a conditional acceptance. And part of it was that, and I am embarrassed that I cannot remember who wrote this paper. It recently got published. University of Jerusalem sociologist just finished a paper about kind of the social construction of science and the revise and resubmit process for qualitative articles and how it changes things over time. Well, I can tell you my work was part of that, their study. They did a lot of analysis of my R&Rs, they were all over the place. And one of the things that the R&Rs did, if you ever do read my paper, is it really pushed us to do some quantification, or what we term counting of things, which I was fortunately able to do given the structure of the drug court, because we had these sessions, because we had these cases that were that were on the docket. So we had these comparable units. We had the same group of drug court professionals analyzing them. We had sanctions that were relatively formulaic. And so we had these different ways to count things, from eventually how often logics were invoked and by whom. but also things like the severity of sanction we were able to code, or how many cases a logic was invoked in, or how many logics were invoked in the negotiation of a particular case. All of these things kind of you'll see in the ASQ paper were part of it, were part of the paper in ways that they were not, that data was not part of the paper before the first R&R. Before the first R&R, we had very basic counts of how often logics were invoked. And got back a whole lot of feedback from two of the reviewers suggesting that we do more of these counts. And with each iteration, they pushed us further and further with these counts. But what happened as a result of that was a lot of that was at the expense of the rich qualitative of the data. You know, we sacrificed quite a bit of the data we would have otherwise included to make the compelling case. And I don't think that the case would have been compromised. I don't think that our case was any less strong had we had a almost entirely qualitative paper without the counts. But it would not have ended up in the venue that it did, had we not agreed to do that and really push ourselves. And it was difficult to go back and to try to scrub the data. I shouldn't say that, to try to get like missing data through court records and talk with the clerk of court about certain things. Like this case happened and the initials of this client were such and such, and this case happened on such and such day. Can we dig through your old records and look at what was said? You know what I mean? Like, it was very tedious, but it was necessary. So it was a heck of a process trying to go through that, but in the end, it pushed us with the results that we did. But it also leaves open, as an ethnographer and a qualitative researcher, opportunities to do the second paper that I'm doing now, which drills even deeper at the micro level to kind of dissect the processes in which logics are invoked, the sense-making processes, and what's really going on. I think I already mentioned this, but you got to be an active listener. And for me, I am a visual person, and so, for example, I have always fetishized opportunities to people watch. I love watching people. That's the easy part for me. But the listening and training, and my wife can confirm this, training myself to listen and be an active listener is something I've had to work on. And especially during periods of the mundane in the field, it is so hard not to stray to things like writing your grocery list in the corner of your field notes. Another piece of advice I would say is if you can't participate, actually participate, I recommend you should, assuming it's not going to kill you or get you in trouble. I was extraordinarily hesitant to the first time they asked me for my opinion, because, read everything and, from a practical standpoint, we want to remain as neutral as we can, but at the same time, participation is part of an embodiment and practice is part of this. But I didn't know how I'd respond until the first time they asked. And they didn't ask for a while, but it felt natural, and then I started to participate. And it was helpful. The other thing is, and this is kind of surfacey, and I know this will be helpful to some of you, but one of my other primary recommendations is to be yourself, to be authentic. So one of the things I found is this. I remember the first time, early on in the process of going into the field, I was like trying to play a part, like play this researcher scientist, like even kind of like feign inquisitiveness when I wasn't terribly interested in a particular thing that was going on, right? But one of the things I kind of felt, one of the things that you discover over time is that it's really easy for these other people in their authentic lives, even though at first I know they're putting on a show for me too, oftentimes. Although I will say this, it's a heck of a lot harder to put on a show for somebody when you're a part of a larger group and you're forced to do, especially in the professional world. they shed the whole here's the image I want him to have of me thing quite quickly. But for me, it took a little bit longer. Right? I was trying to play this researcher or trying to be extremely excited about everything, right? And I'm actually a pretty excitable guy in real life, but I don't think I was terribly authentic at first, in kind of just being me, whatever that means. I don't even know what that means, but I think everyone can feel it at a gut level. And once I started being myself, and being curious about certain things and not worrying about the other things, and just oftentimes mirroring what was going on with them, it became a lot easier. Another thing is carry a bag with everything you could humanly possibly need. You just don't know. I remember one day I like food. I like to eat, and there was one day where I left home at 7 a.m, drove a long distance, was involved all day with things. I was so busy that at 6 o'clock at night, when I was done with something, I realized I hadn't eaten anything. And to some of the people, maybe that's not a big deal, but to me it is. And so I started keeping granola bars in my bag constantly, right? Or one day I ran out of pens, or a pen, and I remember from that point forward, I've always kept 10 pens in my bag. And other things, anything you could humanly possibly need, make sure you keep it with you. Extra batteries if you're doing audio recordings. I was doing audio recordings at times, and twice I ran out of batteries, and it sucked because lo and behold, those happened to be days that were extremely eventful at the drug court, and I wish I had those audio transcripts, because they were during parts of the negotiation process that the clerk of court doesn't record things. And then the last thing I'll say, the last two things I'll say is this: you got to be patient. Don't spend too much time trying to see through things, see behind the curtain as to what's going on, the inner workings from the standpoint of an academic. The more time I spent trying to see through things instead of just consume it and let it all come in, the harder it got. And so after a while, I just kind of soak it all in. And then the last thing is time. The ethnographer's life is a totally different life than my friends who are quantitative researchers with big data sets, who, if they decide to start doing analysis on their data sets at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday night and work until 6 a.m., they can. Well, until I get to the point of analysis, okay, I can't do that. I am at the whim and mercy of the people and thing that I am observing. And so it takes a lot of time, as does, I think, the process of analysis and writing, which means we publish less, which means there's oftentimes more writing on our publications, and on and on and on. That, and I will say, you need to be prepared, because reading between the lines, I was castigated on a few occasions for the ethnographic, for employing an ethnography as if it was inferior methodologically, or as if it wasn't as rigorous as quantitative work. And so over time, one of the things you do is you kind of develop logics and rationales for that, to handle people that forward that kind of really misguided perspective on methods.